In a small, bustling town where everyone knew each other by name, there was a charming little restaurant nestled on the corner of Maple Street. This restaurant wasn't just known for its delicious food, but also for the warmth and hospitality of its staff. Among them was a young waiter named Jack, who had been working there for the past few years. Jack wasn't just any waiter. He was the kind of person who remembered the names and favorite dishes of all the regulars, who would go out of his way to make sure every customer left with a smile. He was well-liked by his co-workers and adored by the patrons, not just for his efficiency, but for his kindness. Jack came from a humble background. He had grown up in the neighboring town, where his family struggled to make ends meet. His father had passed away when Jack was just a child, and his mother had worked multiple jobs to support him and his two younger siblings. Despite their hardships, Jack had always been taught the importance of compassion, empathy, and helping those in need. These values were deeply ingrained in him, and they shaped the way he treated everyone around him. One chilly autumn afternoon, as the orange and yellow leaves danced in the wind outside, an elderly lady walked into the restaurant. She was a small, frail woman with silver hair neatly tied back in a bun. Her clothes were modest, and she clutched her handbag tightly as she made her way to a corner table. Jack noticed her immediately. She wasn't one of the regulars, but there was something about her that caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she hesitated before entering, or the way her eyes seemed to scan the room nervously, as if she was unsure of being there. Jack approached her table with his usual warm smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to Maple Street Bistro. Can I get you something to drink to start?" The old lady looked up at him with kind but tired eyes. "Just some water, please," she replied softly. As Jack poured her a glass of water. He couldn't help but notice how she seemed to be deep in thought, her hands trembling slightly as she held the menu. "Take your time. There's no rush," he reassured her before stepping away to give her some space. From behind the counter, Jack continued to observe the old lady. She seemed lost in her own world, her eyes occasionally drifting to the window where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. After a few minutes, she finally decided on her order and signaled for Jack. "I'll have a chicken soup, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excellent choice," Jack said, making a note of her order. "It's one of our specialties. I'll bring it out for you as soon as it's ready." As he walked back to the kitchen, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The old lady reminded him of his own grandmother, who had passed away a few years ago. She had the same gentle demeanor, the same quiet strength. There was a sadness in her eyes that tugged at his heartstrings, and he wondered what might be troubling her. The restaurant wasn't too busy that afternoon, so Jack made a point of checking on the old lady frequently. Each time he approached her table, she would smile politely and thank him, but there was a lingering melancholy in her expression that he couldn't ignore. When her soup arrived, the old lady seemed more relaxed. She took small, deliberate sips, savoring the warmth of the broth. Jack noticed that she ate slowly, as if she was in no hurry to leave. This gave him an opportunity to engage her in conversation. "Is the soup to your liking, ma'am?" he asked as he refilled her water glass. "It's wonderful, thank you," she replied with a faint smile. "Just what I needed on a day like this." "I'm glad to hear that," Jack said, pausing for a moment before adding, "I couldn't help but notice that you seem a little preoccupied. Is everything all right?" The old lady looked up at him, surprised by his concern. For a moment, it seemed like she might brush off his question, but then she sighed deeply, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. "It's kind of you to ask," she said softly. "I've just had a lot on my mind lately. Life hasn't been easy, and sometimes it feels like it's all just too much." Jack felt a pang of empathy for the woman. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel overwhelmed by the burdens of life. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her, sensing that she might need someone to talk to. "Would you like to talk about it?" he offered gently. "Sometimes it helps to share what's on your mind." The old lady hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her napkin. But there was something in Jack's kind eyes that made her feel safe, and before she knew it, she found herself opening up to him. "My name is Margaret," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I lost my husband about a year ago. We were married for over 50 years, and his passing left a void in my life that I can't seem to fill. We had no children, and most of my friends have passed on as well. It's just me now, and every day feels like a struggle. Jack listened intently, his heart aching for the woman sitting across from him. He couldn't imagine the pain of losing someone you'd spent your entire life with, the loneliness that must accompany such a loss. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Margaret," he said sincerely. "I can't pretend to know what you're going through, but I do know that it's okay to grieve, to feel sad. It's a part of healing." Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, Jack. It's been so hard, and I suppose I've been keeping it all bottled up inside. Coming here today was an attempt to break out of the isolation I've felt, but it's difficult. I miss him so much." Jack reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "You're not alone, Margaret. There are people who care, who want to help. I'm glad you came here today, and I'm glad I got to meet you." For the first time since she had entered the restaurant, Margaret's smile reached her eyes. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was genuine. "You're a very kind young man, Jack. Your mother must be proud of the person you've become." Jack's thoughts drifted to his own mother, who had worked so hard to raise him and his siblings. He knew she would have done anything to see him happy, to see him succeed. In that moment, he realized that his mother's lessons and compassion had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully appreciated until now. As Margaret finished her meal, Jack discreetly spoke to the chef, arranging for a small dessert to be sent to her table, compliments of the restaurant. It was a gesture he hoped would brighten her day just a little bit more. When the dessert arrived, a slice of warm apple pie with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "I didn't order this," she said, looking up at Jack. "It's on the house," Jack replied with a wink. "Consider it our way of saying thank you for spending your afternoon with us." Margaret chuckled softly, touched by the gesture. "You've done more for me today than you realize, Jack. I won't forget your kindness." As the afternoon wore on, the restaurant began to fill up with the usual evening crowd. Jack's duties pulled him away from Margaret's table, but he kept an eye on her from a distance, making sure she was comfortable and attended to. He was pleased to see that she seemed more at ease now, her earlier sadness having lifted somewhat. Eventually, Margaret signaled for the bill, and Jack hurried over to her table with a check in hand. But as she reached in her handbag to retrieve her wallet, Jack noticed a flicker of worry cross her face. She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her belongings. That Jack's heart sank. He had seen this before, an elderly person who was perhaps too proud to admit they were struggling financially, or who had simply miscalculated the cost of their meal. He knew Margaret's situation was likely compounded by her recent loss, and the last thing he wanted was for her to feel embarrassed or distressed. Without thinking twice, Jack made a decision. He discreetly took the check from her hand and smiled. "You know what, Margaret? Today's meal is on me. Consider it a small gift from one friend to another." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Oh, Jack, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Jack interrupted gently. "It would make me very happy to do this for you. It's the least I can do after the wonderful conversation we had." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, and she reached out to grasp Jack's hand. "You're an angel, Jack. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say." "There's no need to say anything," Jack replied with a warm smile. "Just promise me you'll come back and visit us again soon. I'd love to see you again." Margaret nodded, unable to speak as she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She stood up slowly, her frail body seeming lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She hugged Jack tightly, her small frame shaking with emotion. "Take care, Margaret," Jack whispered as he returned the hug. "And remember, you're not alone." With one last grateful smile, Margaret made her way out of the restaurant, her steps a little steadier, her heart a little lighter. Jack watched her go, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and peace. He had done what he could to brighten someone's day, to ease their pain, and that was enough for him. But little did Jack know that this simple act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The small seed of compassion he had planted that day would soon grow into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. Jack had no idea that the simple gesture of paying Margaret's bill would trigger such a chain of events, but it wasn't long before the consequences of his actions began to unfold. The afternoon rush had come and gone. And as the dinner crowd settled into their tables, the restaurant's warm, inviting atmosphere seemed to wrap itself around each patron like a cozy blanket. The soft clinking of silverware, the gentle murmur of conversations, and the mouth-watering aroma of freshly prepared meals filled the air. But beneath this serene exterior, a storm was brewing. Jack, busy as ever, moved from table to table with his usual efficiency, his mind still lingering on the encounter with Margaret. He couldn't shake the feeling of deep satisfaction he felt knowing he had made a difference in someone's day. Little did he know, however, that the management was about to take notice of his actions in a way he hadn't anticipated. It all started when the restaurant's manager, Mr. Thompson, caught wind of what had happened. Mr. Thompson was a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a stern demeanor. He ran the restaurant with an iron fist, ensuring that everything operated with precision and efficiency. He valued rules, regulations, and profit margins above all else, believing that a tightly run ship was the key to success in the competitive world of dining. Mr. Thompson made his usual rounds through the restaurant that evening, greeting regulars and keeping a watchful eye on the staff. One of the waitresses, a sharp-eyed young woman named Lisa, approached him with a concerned expression. "Mr. Thompson, could I have a word?" she asked, her voice low as she glanced nervously around to make sure no one was listening. "What is it, Lisa?" Mr. Thompson replied, his brow furrowing slightly. He could tell by her tone that something was bothering her. "It's about Jack," she said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "I overheard him earlier. He paid for a customer's bill out of his own pocket." Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Paid for a customer's bill? Why would he do that?" "I'm not entirely sure," Lisa admitted, "but it was an older lady. I think he felt sorry for her or something. I just thought you should know." Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. While he appreciated the dedication of his staff, he had little tolerance for actions that deviated from standard protocol. The restaurant had a strict policy when it came to handling customers' bills, and employees were not authorized to cover expenses, regardless of the circumstances. It wasn't just about the money. It was about maintaining control and ensuring that the business was run in a disciplined manner. "Thank you, Lisa," Mr. Thompson said curtly, dismissing her with a nod. As she walked away, he stood in the middle of the dining room, contemplating his next move. Jack, blissfully unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, continued serving his tables, chatting with customers, and ensuring that everyone was satisfied. His natural charisma and genuine care for the patrons had always set him apart from the rest of the staff, and it was one of the reasons why he had become such a beloved figure at the restaurant. But Mr. Thompson saw things differently. To him, Jack's actions represented a breach of conduct, an example of an employee overstepping his boundaries. That as the evening wore on, Mr. Thompson's irritation grew. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that this situation required immediate attention. He couldn't afford to let such behavior go unchecked. It would set a dangerous precedent and could potentially lead to other staff members thinking they could do the same. The rules were there for a reason, and it was his job to enforce them. After the last of the dinner crowd had been served and the restaurant began to wind down for the night, Mr. Thompson decided it was time to confront Jack. He waited until most of the other employees had left the dining area, giving them just enough time to close out their shifts. As Jack wiped down the last of the tables, preparing for the final cleanup, Mr. Thompson approached him, his expression as stern as ever. "Jack," he called out, his voice carrying a weight that made Jack immediately stand up straight, sensing that something was wrong. "I need to have a word with you in my office. Now." Jack blinked in surprise. He had never been summoned to Mr. Thompson's office before, and the serious tone in his voice sent a shiver of unease through him. He nodded, quickly finishing up his task before following Mr. Thompson to the back of the restaurant. The office was a small, cramped room filled with paperwork, files, and the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. It was a place Jack had always avoided, knowing that it was usually reserved for private conversations or disciplinary actions. Once inside, Mr. Thompson closed the door behind them and motioned for Jack to sit down. Jack complied, feeling a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He had no idea what this was about, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Jack," Mr. Thompson began, his voice low and measured, "I've been made aware of something that happened earlier today, and I want to hear it directly from you." Is it true that you paid for a customer's bill out of your own pocket? Jack's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He hadn't expected this to be the reason for their meeting, but he quickly realized that this must have been what prompted it. He nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. Yes, sir. There was an elderly lady who came in for lunch. Her name was Margaret. She seemed like she was going through a tough time, and I noticed she was having trouble when it came time to pay. I just wanted to help her out, so I decided to cover her bill. Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed further, his expression hardening. Jack, do you understand that this is against company policy? We have clear guidelines on how to handle customer transactions, and paying for a customer's meal yourself is not part of those guidelines. You had no authority to make that decision. Jack felt his face flush with embarrassment and frustration. He had acted out of compassion, out of a genuine desire to help someone in need, and now he was being reprimanded for it. He tried to keep his voice steady as he responded. I understand that, Mr. Thompson, but I just felt like it was the right thing to do in that moment. She didn't ask for help, but I could see she was struggling. I thought it was a small gesture that could make a big difference for her. Mr. Thompson crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair as he regarded Jack with a cold, analytical gaze. This isn't about what you felt was right, Jack. This is about following the rules. We're running a business here, and we can't afford to have employees making decisions like this on their own. It creates liabilities, sets a precedent, and could potentially lead to other issues down the line. Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words to explain his actions. He had never been one to question authority, but in this case, he couldn't help but feel that what he had done was justified. It wasn't about breaking the rules. It was about helping someone in need. Mr. Thompson, I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, Jack said, his voice calm but resolute. I just wanted to do something good for someone who seemed like they needed it. I thought that was part of what we stand for here, treating our customers with kindness and respect. But Mr. Thompson was unmoved. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk as he stared directly at Jack. Kindness and respect are important, Jack, but so are the rules. And in this case, you broke them. I have to enforce the policies that are in place for a reason. We can't have employees going off script and making their own decisions like this. There was a heavy silence in the room as Jack realized the gravity of the situation. He had hoped that Mr. Thompson would understand his intentions, that perhaps he would see the value in what Jack had done. But it was clear that the manager was more concerned with maintaining order and adherence to protocol than with the nuances of individual circumstances. Mr. Thompson sighed, a note of finality in his voice as he spoke again. I'm afraid I have no choice but to let you go, Jack. I can't have someone working here who doesn't follow the rules. I'll arrange for your final paycheck to be processed, and you can collect it tomorrow. I'll also provide you with a reference should you need it. Jack felt his heart drop into his stomach. Fired? The word hit him like a punch to the gut. He had never been fired from a job before, and the realization that he was losing his position over an act of kindness was both shocking and disheartening. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but he knew that Mr. Thompson had made up his mind. There was no changing it that he stood up slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I understand, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for the opportunity to work here. Mr. Thompson gave a curt nod, his expression unchanged. Good luck, Jack. I hope you find success in your future endeavors. With that, Jack turned and left the office, his mind reeling from what had just happened. As he walked through the now empty restaurant, the tables and chairs seemed to blur together, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling foreign and distant. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had been serving customers with a smile, unaware that his entire world was about to be turned upside down. But he stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the quiet street. Jack stood there for a moment, staring up at the stars that dotted the dark sky, trying to process everything that had just occurred. He felt a mix of emotions, confusion, frustration, sadness, and even a tinge of anger. But above all, he felt a deep sense of injustice. How could something so small, so well-intentioned, lead to such a harsh consequence? He had simply wanted to help someone, to brighten an old woman's day, and now he was out of a job because of it. The thought made his chest tighten with a mixture of regret and disbelief. Jack began to walk, his footsteps echoing softly on the empty sidewalk. The town was quiet at this hour. Most of the shops closed and the streets deserted. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. As he walked, he replayed the events of the day in his mind, trying to make sense of them. That he thought about Margaret, about the look of gratitude in her eyes when he had offered to pay her bill. He thought about the conversation they had shared, about the pain and loneliness she had confided in him. And then he thought about Mr. Thompson's cold, rigid response, his refusal to see beyond the black and white rules of the business. The more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't regret what he had done. Yes, it had cost him his job, but it had also given him a sense of purpose, a reminder of the values that his mother had instilled in him. Compassion, empathy, and kindness. These were the things that truly mattered, the things that made the world a better place. That as he continued to walk, Jack felt a sense of clarity begin to wash over him. He knew that what had happened was unfair, but he also knew that he couldn't dwell on it. He had to move forward, to find a way to turn this setback into something positive. The night was growing colder, and Jack pulled his jacket tighter around him as he made his way home. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He would have to figure out what to do next, how to find another job, how to explain what had happened to his family. But for now, he allowed himself to simply breathe, to take in the crisp air and the quiet solitude of the night. That as he reached his small apartment, Jack paused at the door, taking one last look at the night sky. He couldn't predict what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let this experience make him bitter or cynical. He would hold on to the values that had guided him so far, and he would continue to do what he believed was right, no matter the consequences. With that resolve in his heart, Jack unlocked the door and stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. But little did Jack know, his story was far from over. The ripple effects of his kind gesture were just beginning to spread, and soon, his life would be changed in ways he could never have imagined. For while Jack had lost his job, he had gained something far more valuable, a connection to a world of possibilities that was about to open up before him, all because of one simple act of kindness. As the days passed, Jack tried to adjust to his new reality. Losing his job had been a blow, but it had also sparked something within him, a renewed sense of purpose and a determination not to let the unfairness of the situation break him. He spent his mornings job hunting, applying to restaurants, cafes, and diners all over town. But as the rejections piled up, Jack couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of discouragement. Meanwhile, Margaret, the elderly woman whose bill Jack had paid, couldn't stop thinking about the young waiter who had shown her such kindness. She had lived a long life, filled with both joy and sorrow, but it had been a long time since anyone had gone out of their way to help her without expecting something in return. Jack's generosity had touched her deeply, more than she had been able to express at the time. Margaret lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Her husband, Robert, had passed away several years earlier, leaving her to navigate the twilight of her life on her own. Robert had been the love of her life, a man of integrity and kindness, whose success in business had afforded them a comfortable life. Yet despite his wealth, Robert had always remained humble, never forgetting the struggles of his own upbringing. It was a value he had instilled in Margaret, and together they had always believed in using their fortune to help others. After Robert's passing, Margaret had felt adrift. The loneliness had been overwhelming at times, and though she had tried to stay connected with friends and neighbors, there was an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. That's why Jack's simple act of kindness had meant so much to her. It had reminded her of Robert, of the man who had always believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. Today, as she sat in her cozy living room, sipping tea and looking out at the autumn leaves falling from the trees, Margaret made a decision. She had to do something for Jack, to repay him in some small way for the kindness he had shown her. But how? She knew he had lost his job because of what he did for her, and the thought of it filled her with guilt. She didn't have much influence, but she knew someone who did, someone who might be able to help. Margaret reached for the phone, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed a number she hadn't called in a long time. After a few rings, a deep, familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Edward," Margaret said, her voice warm and a little tentative. "It's Margaret. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret, of course not. It's so good to hear from you. How have you been? Edward Hawthorne was a man of considerable means, a close friend of Margaret and Robert's for many years. He had been a regular at the same country club where Robert had spent his weekends, and the two had struck up a friendship that had lasted decades. Edward was a successful entrepreneur, known for his sharp business acumen and generous philanthropy. He had always admired Robert and had been deeply saddened by his passing. Though Edward had stayed in touch with Margaret, their contact had become less frequent over the years, especially after his own wife passed away. "I'm doing well, thank you," Margaret replied, smiling at the sound of her old friend's voice. "But Edward, I need to ask you a favor. There's a young man I met recently, a waiter at a restaurant in town. He did something very kind for me, but as a result, he lost his job. I was wondering if there might be something you could do to help him." Edward listened intently as Margaret recounted the story of how Jack had paid for her meal and the unfair treatment he had received from his employer. As she spoke, Edward felt a surge of indignation. The idea that someone could be punished for an act of kindness went against everything he believed in. He had always been a firm advocate of rewarding good deeds, not punishing them. "Margaret," Edward said, his voice firm with resolve, "I want you to give me this young man's information. I'll make sure he's taken care of. No one should be treated the way he was, especially not for doing something so generous." Margaret felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Edward. I knew I could count on you. His name is Jack Miller. I don't have his contact information, but I'm sure he's still looking for work. If there's anything you can do, I would be so grateful." "Leave it to me," Edward replied. "I'll find him. And don't worry, Margaret. I'll make sure he gets what he deserves." After hanging up the phone, Edward sat back in his leather armchair, deep in thought. Jack Miller. The name didn't ring any bells, but Edward knew a lot of people in town, and it wouldn't take long to track him down. He had connections in every sector, from business to hospitality, and if this young man needed a job, Edward would find him one. But the more Edward thought about it, the more he realized that simply finding Jack another job wouldn't be enough. He wanted to do more, something that would truly honor Jack's selflessness and ensure that he never had to face such injustice again. Edward decided to start by making a few phone calls. He reached out to his network of friends and associates, asking if anyone knew of a young man named Jack Miller who had recently worked as a waiter. Within a few hours, Edward had a lead. One of his contacts, a restaurant owner downtown, mentioned that he had heard about a waiter who had been fired for covering a customer's bill. It was the talk of the local restaurant community, as it had struck many as an unusually harsh punishment for such a minor offense. Armed with this information, Edward decided to take a more direct approach. The next morning, he got dressed in his usual crisp suit and tie, climbed into his sleek black car, and drove to the address his contact had given him. It was a modest apartment building on the outskirts of town, not far from the restaurant where Jack had worked. Edward parked his car and made his way up the stairs to Jack's apartment. When he reached the door, Edward hesitated for a moment. He knew that showing up unannounced might be a bit overwhelming, but he also knew that he wanted to meet Jack face to face to get a sense of the kind of person he was. Taking a deep breath, Edward knocked on the door. That a few moments later, the door opened, and Jack stood before him, looking surprised and a little confused. He was dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, his hair slightly tousled as if he had just woken up. Edward could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness of someone who had been through a lot in a short amount of time. "Mr. Miller?" Edward asked, extending his hand with a warm smile. "My name is Edward Hawthorne. I'm a friend of Margaret, the lady whose bill you paid at the restaurant." Jack blinked in surprise, shaking Edward's hand. "Oh yes, of course. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Hawthorne. Please come in." Jack stepped aside to let Edward into the small apartment. It was a humble space, simply furnished but tidy, with a few personal touches that made it feel like home. Edward noticed a stack of job applications on the kitchen table, along with a half-empty cup of coffee. "Thank you for seeing me," Edward said as he took a seat on the couch. "I won't take up too much of your time, but I wanted to come by and speak with you personally. Margaret told me what happened, and I wanted to see how you're doing." Jack shrugged, sitting down across from Edward. "I'm doing all right, I guess. It's been tough, but I'm trying to stay positive. I've been applying for jobs, but it's been slow going." Edward nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand. It's never easy to lose a job, especially under such circumstances. But I have to say, Jack, I'm deeply impressed by what you did for Margaret. It's not every day you meet someone willing to put others before themselves, especially when it comes to their livelihood. Jack felt a flush of embarrassment and gratitude at Edward's words. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I just wanted to help her out. She reminded me of my mother, I guess. She passed away a few years ago. I know how hard it can be for older people on their own. Edward's heart softened at Jack's honesty. He could see that this was a young man of strong character, someone who had been raised with good values and a sense of responsibility to others. It only strengthened his resolve to help Jack in any way he could. Well, Jack, Edward said, leaning forward slightly, I'm not just here to commend you. I want to offer you an opportunity. I have a few businesses in town, and I'm always on the lookout for good people to join my team. I know you have experience in hospitality, but I'm also willing to train you in other areas if you're interested. I think someone with your values and work ethic could do very well in my organization. Jack's eyes widened in surprise. He had been expecting a kind word or maybe a small gesture of thanks, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. A job offer from someone as influential as Edward Hawthorne was an opportunity that didn't come around every day. I don't know what to say, Jack stammered, feeling a mix of excitement and disbelief. I really appreciate the offer, Mr. Hawthorne. I'd love to learn more about what you have in mind. Edward smiled, pleased by Jack's reaction. I'm glad to hear that, Jack. We can discuss the details later, but I want you to know that this isn't just about giving you a job. It's about investing in your future. I believe that people like you, people with integrity and compassion, deserve to be supported and given the chance to succeed. If you're willing to work hard, I'm willing to help you get to where you want to be. Jack nodded, still trying to process everything that was happening. He had gone from feeling hopeless and uncertain about his future to being offered a lifeline by one of the most respected men in town. It was almost too good to be true. As they continued to talk, Edward shared more about his businesses and the different roles he had in mind for Jack. He spoke about his late wife and how she had always believed in giving people a second chance and lifting others up when they were down. Edward saw this as an extension of that philosophy, a way to honor her memory by helping someone who had shown the kind of character she had admired. That'd be why the time Edward left Jack's apartment. The two had made plans to meet again the following week to discuss the details of Jack's new role. Jack felt a sense of hope and excitement that he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since losing his job, he felt like things were finally looking up. But what neither Jack nor Edward knew at that moment was just how much this meeting would change their lives. For Edward, helping Jack was more than just an act of charity. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would lead him to rediscover the joy of making a difference in the lives of others. And for Jack, this was the start of a journey that would take him to places he had never imagined, opening doors to opportunities he had never dreamed possible. That as Edward drove away from Jack's apartment, he couldn't help but smile to himself. He had always believed in the power of kindness, in the idea that doing good for others would eventually come back to you in unexpected ways. And in this case, it seemed that belief was about to be proven true once again. Meanwhile, Jack stood at the window, watching Edward's car disappear down the street. He felt a sense of awe and gratitude wash over him, along with a renewed determination to make the most of this opportunity. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead, new skills to learn, and hard work to be done. But Jack was ready. He was ready to take on whatever came next, knowing that this was his chance to build a better future, not just for himself, but for those around him as well. And so, with a heart full of hope and a mind focused on the possibilities that lay ahead, Jack began to prepare for the next chapter of his life. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of an incredible journey, one that would not only change his own life, but touch the lives of many others along the way. The news of Edward Hawthorne's involvement in Jack's situation spread through the town like wildfire. In a place where everyone seemed to know each other, stories traveled fast. Jack's act of kindness, once a simple gesture that led to his dismissal, had now become the catalyst for a series of events that would change lives in ways no one could have predicted. The small town was abuzz with talk of how the millionaire philanthropist had personally stepped in to help a young man who had been wronged. For many, It was a story that warmed their hearts, a reminder that there were still people who believed in doing the right thing. For others, it was a sign that perhaps they too could make a difference, even in small ways. This was the ripple effect that began to spread through the community, touching lives far beyond the original incident. Jack, however, was still coming to terms with his new reality. The meeting with Edward had left him feeling both excited and overwhelmed. He had spent so long struggling just to get by that the prospect of working for someone like Edward seemed almost unreal. The idea that his small act of kindness could lead to such an incredible opportunity was something he was still trying to wrap his head around. But as the days passed, Jack began working with Edward, learning the ropes of his new role. Edward had placed him in a managerial position at one of his smaller businesses, a cafe that was in need of new leadership. It was a big step up from his previous job as a waiter, and Jack was determined to prove himself worthy of the trust Edward had placed in him. The cafe, which had been struggling under previous management, began to thrive under Jack's leadership. He brought the same kindness and empathy that had led him to help Margaret into his work, treating his staff with respect and encouraging them to give their best. Jack knew what it was like to be in their shoes, to work long hours for little pay, and he wanted to create an environment where they felt valued and supported. As the cafe began to flourish, Jack's confidence grew. He discovered that he had a natural talent for management, for bringing out the best in people and creating a sense of community among his staff. Edward, who had been keeping a close eye on Jack's progress, was impressed. He saw in Jack not just a capable manager, but a leader, someone who could inspire others and create positive change wherever he went. But the impact of Jack's journey didn't stop at the cafe. Inspired by his story, other business owners in the town began to rethink the way they treated their employees. Conversations about fairness, kindness, and the importance of valuing people began to take root in places where they had long been ignored. The town, which had once been known for its rigid business practices, was slowly transforming into a place where people mattered more than profit. Margaret, too, felt the effects of Jack's success. She had always been a quiet presence in the town, known to few and seen by even fewer. But after Edward had told her how well Jack was doing, Margaret began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. She started to volunteer at local charities, using her time and resources to help those who were struggling. Much like Jack had helped her one day, while volunteering at a soup kitchen, Margaret ran into Jack. He was there with a few of his staff, serving meals to the homeless. Seeing him in this context, surrounded by people who looked up to him and respected him, Margaret couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. She had always believed in the goodness of people, but Jack had reminded her of how powerful that goodness could be when it was given the chance to shine. "Jack," Margaret said, approaching him with a warm smile. "It's so wonderful to see you here. I've heard so much about the work you're doing." Jack looked up, surprised to see Margaret. He hadn't expected to run into her here, but seeing her brought back memories of the day that had changed everything. "Margaret," he replied, smiling back. "I'm glad you're here. This place means a lot to me. It's a chance to give back, to help others the way people have helped me." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You've done so much more than that, Jack. You've inspired a whole town. People are talking about you, about the way you've turned things around at the cafe. You've shown them that kindness and integrity aren't just words, they're ways of living." Jack felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had never set out to inspire anyone, least of all himself. All he had wanted was to do the right thing, to help someone in need. That it had led to all of this, new opportunities, a thriving business, and the respect of his peers, was something he hadn't anticipated. "I'm just trying to do my best," Jack said quietly. "I've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." Margaret reached out and took Jack's hand in hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You haven't wasted it, Jack. You've made the most of it, and that's something to be proud of. Robert would have been so proud of you too. He always believed that helping others was the greatest thing you could do in life." Hearing those words from Margaret brought a lump to Jack's throat. He had never met Robert, but from everything he had heard, Jack knew that he had been a man of great character. To be compared to him, to be told that he would have been proud, was the highest compliment Jack could imagine. "Thank you, Margaret," Jack said, his voice filled with gratitude. "That means more to me than you know." As they stood there, surrounded by the bustling activity of the soup kitchen, Jack felt a deep sense of connection to Margaret, to Edward, and to the community that had embraced him. He realized that he was no longer the struggling waiter who had lost his job over a simple act of kindness. He was someone who had been given a chance to make a difference, and he had taken that chance and run with it. The months that followed were some of the most fulfilling of Jack's life. Under his leadership, the cafe became a cornerstone of the community, a place where people could come together, share a meal, and feel a sense of belonging. Jack's reputation as a fair and compassionate leader spread, and before long, he was being approached with offers to take on more responsibilities within Edward's business empire. But Jack remained grounded. He knew that none of this would have been possible without the kindness he had shown to Margaret, the generosity of Edward, and the support of his team. He continued to work hard, always striving to live up to the values that had brought him to this point. Edward, meanwhile, watched with pride as Jack's career flourished. He had always believed in investing in people, in giving them the tools and support they needed to succeed. But Jack was special. He had taken that investment and turned it into something extraordinary, something that was making a real difference in the world. One day, as Edward and Jack sat together in Edward's office, discussing plans for the future, Edward couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. It was a journey that had started with a simple act of kindness, but had grown into something so much more. "Jack," Edward said, leaning back in his chair, "I want you to know how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. You've taken every opportunity that's come your way and made the most of it. But more than that, you've stayed true to who you are. You've shown everyone that success doesn't have to come at the expense of others, that it's possible to be both successful and kind." Jack smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Thank you, Edward. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You gave me a chance when no one else would, and I'll always be grateful for that." Edward shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "You earned that chance, Jack, and you've repaid it 100 times over. But there's something else I want to talk to you about, something that could be the next step in your journey." Jack leaned forward, intrigued. "What is it?" Edward reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, placing it in front of Jack. "I've been thinking a lot about the impact you've had, not just on the cafe, but on the community as a whole. I believe it's time for you to take on a larger role, a leadership position within the company. I want you to help me oversee our entire network of businesses, to bring the same values and principles you've applied at the cafe to everything we do." Jack's eyes widened as he opened the folder and saw the details of the offer inside. It was an incredible opportunity, one that would allow him to influence the direction of the entire company, to ensure that the culture of kindness and integrity he believed in was at the heart of everything they did. I don't know what to say," Jack stammered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the offer. "This is more than I ever imagined." Edward smiled, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and affection. "You've earned it, Jack, and I can't think of anyone better suited for the job. You have a gift for leadership, for bringing out the best in people. I want you to use that gift to help us build something truly special, something that will make a difference in the world." Jack felt a surge of determination as he looked at Edward. He knew this was a turning point in his life, a moment that would define the path he would take from here on out. It was a challenge, but it was one he was ready to embrace. "Thank you, Edward," Jack said, his voice steady with resolve. "I'm ready. I'll do everything I can to make sure we succeed, to build a company that stands for something more than just profit." Edward nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "I know you will, Jack, and I'll be with you every step of the way." As they shook hands, sealing the agreement, both men knew that this was the beginning of something extraordinary. It was the start of a new chapter, not just for Jack, but for everyone whose lives he would touch in the years to come. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and a mind focused on the future, Jack embarked on the next stage of his journey. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that with Edward's support and his own unwavering commitment to doing what was right, he could overcome anything that came his way. In the end, it wasn't just about building a successful business. It was about building a legacy of kindness, integrity, and the belief that one person, no matter how small their actions might seem, could make a difference in the world. And as Jack set out on this new path, He knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold, touching lives and inspiring others for years to come. The ripple effect of that one simple act of kindness would continue to spread, creating waves of change that would transform not just the town, but the world beyond it. And Jack, who had once been a struggling waiter, was now at the helm of that change, leading the way with a heart full of hope and a spirit driven by compassion. As he walked out of Edward's office that day, the sun shining brightly overhead, Jack couldn't help but smile. This was his moment, his chance to make a difference. And he was ready to take it, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he had the power to create a better future, not just for himself, but for everyone he encountered along the way. And so, with each step he took, Jack felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had never known before. He was no longer just a man trying to get by. He was a man on a mission, a man determined to make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time.